welcome to the IEEE YouTube channel. I'm Serisi, a third-year physiotherapy and rehabilitation student, and at the same time chair of the Engineering in Medicine and Biology Society. Thank you all for joining us for today's new The Unspoken Language of Healing podcast episode. Before we begin, I would also like to introduce my vice chair. Could you introduce yourself briefly?
Okay. Hi, everyone. I am Mehlika, a third-year nursing student and at the same time vice chair of the EMBS. Thank you to everyone.
Thank you for your introduction. And now it is a great pleasure to welcome our guest, Associate Professor Milena Raffi from the University of Bologna.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation to join your podcast. I'm Milena Raffi. I'm an Associate Professor at the University of Bologna. My background is in neuroscience and neurophysiology. I have a degree, PhD in neuroscience and a postdoc in neurophysiology. So I did my postdoc in the United States with Professor Ralph Siegel as a supervisor. Then I moved to Bologna for a tenure track position and then associate professor position. So my research interest is in neurophysiology. So we study attention, eye movements, and especially visual perception. We also study the visual motor integration and mechanisms that allow us to perceive optic flow, which is the visual motion that occurs on our retina when we move in the environment. Lately, as a model, we are using diabetes to study again the visual motor integration, because we think that studying the visual motor integration in people who has some impairment, like a neural impairment due to the pathology, would help covering these mechanisms, these important mechanisms that drive us to navigate in the environment. I'm also involved in some public health initiatives like diabetes prevention and also prevention of cardiovascular diseases and neuropathy and retinopathy related to diabetes in both adults and children and adolescents. So this is more or less what my lab is doing right now.
Thank you for the introduction. If you are ready, we can move on to our questions.
Sure.
My first question is, how can the effects of visual perception on postural balance and motor control be explained at a physiological level? Understanding this relationship enables which innovative approaches, particularly in the design of the rehabilitation technologies.
Sure, we can start explaining we move in the environment in our nervous system. We have the integration of multiple signals, like vestibular signals, motor signals, visual signals, auditory signals. So our neurons compute the integration of all these signals in order to give us a clear reconstruction of the extrapersonal and personal space. When we move into the environment, as like addressing earlier, we have optic flows. Optic flows are the moving visual scene that occurs in our eyes, in our retina, when we move. So let's say an observer moving into an environment sees that the objects are moving, but the objects are still. Nothing moves by itself. So this is an apparent motion of objects or of the visual scene caused by our specific movements. So we are able to navigate into in the environment just because we use the distances and the speed relatively of our body and the objects in the environment as cues to navigate. So we continuously an estimation of distances and speed, and we are able to navigate, to avoid obstacles, to work without looking at our target destination. So all these mechanisms are particularly important to our understanding, because without the knowledge of this particular mechanism, without the knowledge of these integrative mechanisms, we cannot really understand how higher function work, like attention or movement generation or memory, for example, decision-making functions, etc. So all these mechanisms have been used to design specific rehabilitation tools, like the visual reality, for example. So the reconstruction, the visual reconstruction in a device of a movie or a complex visual scene. Also, immersive visual feedback system can work on these mechanisms based on the knowledge of these particular mechanisms. So it is important to stress that all technological advances that we have experienced in the past decades are due to the knowledge of these neurophysiological mechanisms.
All right, thank you for your answer. My second question is, how should the connection between the neurocircuits that control eye movements and attention and decision-making process be addressed in terms of cognitive neuroscience?
So we can start explaining that eye movements are not only related to the movements of the eyes. That's important. So of course, eye movements like saccades, like pursuit eye movements, are related to fixate an object in space or jump between objects in space. However, we have other eye movements like microsaccades, for example, which are important for attentional focuses. So these mechanisms, these eye movements selection and the type of eye movements that we make is a fundamental mechanism underlying decision-making processes. So all these functions has been studied in the past decades in animal models and also in human models. Like the subject was asked to fixate a specific point in space and then after a cue to direct the gaze toward the cue or to select an attentional cue within the visual space. So this is example of typical attentional and decision-making tasks. It is important to understand that there is no decision-making without a proper attentional mechanisms underlined by eye movements, basically, because those are strictly connected in specific areas like frontal eye field or parieto-frontal circuit. So we have specific neurons that integrate position of a cue in space, the portion of the space where our attention or our gaze needs to be directed. So we have circuits that act before the eye movement making and the eye pursuit making. So it's a sort of feed-forward mechanisms. So we act in advance to redirect the gaze and to direct attention toward a specific point in the visual space.
So what is the role of visual perception and attention mechanisms in the development of neurotechnological systems such as brain-computer interfaces?
Oh, that's an important question, because without the knowledge of perceptual mechanisms, we cannot really think to design technology. So all these new technologies like the brain-computing interface, for example, as you mentioned, relies on cortical mechanism, basically. So the engineers can use signals deriving from the cortex, from specific neurons in specific areas of the cerebral cortex, and use those signals to develop the brain-computing interface or the machine they want to to design. So basically, everybody has to consider that there is an integration between what we see and how we act. So in other words, perception and action are strictly connected. So we need to perceive the world, all the sensory cues, before making an idea of an action or before making motor plan for this specific action. So brain-computing interface is done to exploit the signals from the cortex and transform it into specific signal. So they transform it into specific command. The knowledge of specific mechanisms related to the integration, neuronal integration for perception functions allow the brain-computing interface to be faster and more adapted to single cases, which is what we actually want.
Thank you for your. It is a little bit complicated system, right?
Oh yes, it is very complicated because I'm trying to explain it in a very easy way for everybody understanding, but it's very complicated because basically what is needed is the signal from cortex, and this signal from cortex has to be transformed in something that a device can read and can replicate. So I'm thinking, for example, about prosthetic. Prosthetic is very complicated because signals can come from the neural system of the person, but has to be transformed in something that the prosthetic can do. So, you know, it's a very complicated integration between something that is coded in a language, like a neuronal language, that has to be coupled with a series of 1 and 0 in engineering language. I think it's great. I mean, it's fantastic. The technology now has reached a very important level. It's fantastic. But still, we need to understand and what is underneath this fantastic work of prosthetic or brain computing interface or signal transfer is very complicated to make, and is possible only because we know at least a little bit of neuronal mechanisms.
Yeah, exactly as you said, it is so complicated and technology is developing every day.
Exactly.
So, from your perspective, what technological developments in biomedical sciences are currently the most promising for shaping the future of health and neurotechnology?
I would say that the most promising are all these devices that bridge perception and action and that consider the physiological functions. So, for example, I'm thinking about the mirror therapy for rehabilitation after amputation. The mirror therapy works pretty well. It's a very simple system. So it's based on duplicate the real limb, so to replace in terms of visual signal the phantom limb with the real limb, and it works pretty well because this therapy changes the neural circuits during the vision of let's say the transformation of the phantom limb into the real limb. So the vision of two limbs make the visual system thinking that the limb is still there, is there again. So during the therapy, the minutes of the hours of the therapy, the visual system and the sensory system is trained to behave or to process signals like the limb is still present in the body. And it trains specific circuits to work, circuits that are suppressed due to the amputation. That's why the mirror system or therapy works. So now the evolution is to use the virtual reality mechanisms and devices for the mirror therapy. So a more immersive environment, and it works pretty well. It's very useful in reducing the pain, the phantom limb pain. It's very simple, but based on particular physiological mechanisms. Another important technology is artificial intelligence, of course. See artificial intelligence very useful for personalized medicine. Artificial intelligence machine trained for answering to questions from patients related to specific pathology can be very helpful and can also help the health system to treat the person in a very specific and personalized way. So I see the technology definitely will be very helpful in the future.
Finally, what advice would you give to students or young researchers who want to pursue a career in neuroscience and biomedical sciences?
Okay, so the very first advice is to be curious, because neuroscience and science in general right now is evolving very quickly. So it's important to have questions. Always having questions make you stay on the top, because questions that we may have now will become old in a couple of years. So it's important to keep the curiosity, always to move forward with the knowledge. A second advice is to understand that right now the interdisciplinarity is very important, because years ago it was not like that. 10, 12 years ago was very different, because everybody studied in his or her field. Right now, the interdisciplinarity of projects is a gold standard. So you cannot really think in a specific field. You need to take into account the views of other scientists, of other experts, even very far from the background. So physiology together with engineers, working with AI, or physics working again with biologists. So you see, there is the necessity to talk about systems looking from different points of view. Another value, in my opinion, is humility, because data are fascinating, but they have to be interpreted in a serious way and very carefully, because our data always tell us something, but we need to really understand what is the message, because most of the time they don't tell us what we would like to read or what we would like to know. They tell us something else. So we have to be rigorous and humble, because there is the need of a lot of respect of what we do. And finally, we need to understand that science is always a human journey. So what we do is to improve the knowledge, and is to study all aspects we like to study, making our life easier. And to improve our knowledge will always make our life easier and more complete. So if a student will stay motivated and curious, I'm sure with a lot of motivation, and let's say the curiosity to study different things. Actually, this is another point. Don't think that you can study the same topic for your life, for the entire life. You may want to change, not dramatically, not, for example, from physics to Latin, but maybe from different aspects of biology or engineers or something. But everything is moving very fast, so it's possible that the projects during scientific life will change a bit. So be prepared for that as well.
Thank you so much for your advice. As you know, I'm a physiotherapy student and my vice chair is a nursing student, and we have also interest about this field. So thank you for this insightful and inspiring conversation. We truly appreciate your time and your valuable contributions. Bye-bye. See you later.
Bye-bye.
And thank you to everyone watching us today. This episode will remain available on the IEEE DEU YouTube channel.
See you guys.
See you.